I've been talking about this off and on for quite some time and looking at this for quite some time. I wanted to look at how, much like Luke talked about, how the first peoples moved into unknown landscapes. And I started out looking at this on a continental scale. My advisor at the University of Wyoming, Bob Kelly, has hypothesized one possible way that people might have done this very quickly, hunting big game, et cetera, which I'll go into more later. And there are some other hypotheses out there that other people have proposed. And I really wanted to look at these and try to test them. There seems to be a big disparity in the community about how people might have moved into unknown landscapes. And I wanted to just looking at how people might have done this, looking at actual archaeological data. So I wanted to quite literally trace the first inhabitants of the Northeast. And like I said, you have to start by asking, how do people move into unknown landscapes? How does this process occur? So I started looking at how people have hypothesized that people move into unknown landscapes. And in this case, our unknown landscape is New England, which we're all familiar with, and of course, parts of southern Quebec, looking at the earliest fluted point users in the region and then subsequent later fluted point using groups in New England and southern Quebec. Didn't really go into the Canadian Maritimes, just for the sake of trying to keep my study areas bounded and reasonable. And what you find is when you start looking at these theories, it's very much a question of speed. Now, keep in mind that when I say speed, these are relative categories, especially when you start looking at the appearance of fluted point technologies throughout North America. Most people would agree that fluted points occur fluted points appear very, very rapidly across most of North America and parts of South America. But it's been hypothesized by various hypotheses have been proposed that talk about whether these colonization events proceeded very, very rapidly, as in Kelly and Todd, 1988, that they were following big game with an Arctic-adapted technological suite. They followed these big game animals. This technological suite was useful across wide geographic areas, across different ecological zones, and that they didn't have to spend a lot of time learning their environment. Alternative to that, there are a number of models that say, no. Learning your local environment is very, very important to mitigate the risk of moving into an unknown environment. And these models are what Jim Beaton dubbed transient explorers. That is, they move very rapidly through an environment. They don't stay in one place for very long. They don't gather a lot of local geographical knowledge or ecological knowledge. Alternative to that is the estate settlers model, where they move less frequently. They put more emphasis on local landscape knowledge, local ecological knowledge, and in turn end up being place-oriented. They're very, very focused on place. So I wanted to, again, test if we can see this in the archaeological record. And to do that, I brought out exemplary models of this. As I first mentioned previously, Kelly and Todd 88, which a number of people cite and continue to cite as an exemplar of how people may have moved into North America. And so Kelly and Todd basically proposed that the first Americans came down through the ice-free corridor with an Arctic-adapted technological suite. They were focused on big game hunting. They came into North America, found a continent populated by a large number of naive prey, and they could basically kill these animals at will. It was very, very easy for them. However, the return rates on these animals would drop off very quickly as they became aware of the human presence, became aware that humans were dangerous to them, and then these groups would then move on to other areas that had also had naive prey, which caused them, basically pushed these Paleo-Indian groups across North America at a very, very rapid rate. And this is how Bob Kelly and Larry Todd explained why Clovis seems to appear so rapidly over such a broad area. Now, and specifically, Kelly and Todd mentioned that they really, really, really didn't put a lot of emphasis on acquiring local landscape knowledge. It was not important to them. They had knowledge of big game behavior, and they had knowledge of stone tool technology. They were very focused on their technology, and that is how they mitigated their relationship with the environment. Alternative to this, Dave Meltzer and also David Anderson say, well, that might work for the arid West, That model might work for the West. However, as soon as these groups encountered the larger river basins, which inevitably led them into the American Southeast and other parts of the East, their rate of colonization slowed. They started to place more emphasis on local resources, particularly plants and small animals. Their diet breadth expanded, and they began focusing on place. They really started to focus on specific places in the landscape, and David Anderson specifically argues that these places were lithic quarries, and the large lithic workshops, large Clovis lithic workshops that they found in the Southeast in various river basins, for example, Topper, or Carson Conshore, or other sites of that nature. Dave Meltzer expanded this to all of North America and said, look, if you're going to be radiating into an unknown environment, you really, really need to know everything about your landscape, because things could go wrong so quickly at such low population densities in a landscape that you just are not that familiar with. So take it slow and learn a lot about it. So there's a problem with all this. These colonization models are both, well, all of them are derived from observations of the Clovis archaeological record, or as I prefer to call it, the early fluted point archaeological record. Because as Luke found out, when you start talking about what exactly Clovis is, you sort of stir up a hornet's nest. So I prefer to just say, well, at least we've got early fluted points and then fluted points that come after. So Clovis-like fluted points and then more Folsom-like fluted points. Also, the real problem arises in that we're not so sure Clovis is first anymore. Right? There have been a number of discoveries in the recent past and not so recent past that shed some serious doubt on whether groups using early fluted point technology were in fact the first people in North America. In fact, some very, very, very serious doubt on that. So how do we control for that? How do we know that these early fluted point using groups weren't just acquiring knowledge from people that were there previous to them, or alternatively that Clovis technology was simply that, just a technology that radiated through an existing, as yet though poorly undefined or poorly defined population. That is, the technology moved, the people really didn't. They already knew their landscape, they were there, they were living, and the technology moved through them. And that's quite difficult. We can't really say for sure that Clovis is in fact a colonizing event. And in fact, I think most of the evidence indicates in fact that it's not in most places. So how do we control for that? Well, this is how. Not all that far from here, 14,000 years ago, you had a continental glacier. And it had buried the landscape, right? So during the terminal Pleistocene, the ice was retreating. It started about 28,000 years ago at Long Island and started moving back from there. It was actually had pulled back pretty far by, well, when the first Clovis groups, or the first fluted point using groups showed up in North America, the earliest dates for Clovis. And you can make it simplified with glacial retreats and various curves that show where the ice margin may have been at various points in time. So what you have here is the ice margin at around 14,000 to 13,800 calendar years before present, down here, down in the Champlain Valley, covering up northern Vermont, northern New Hampshire, and quite a lot of northern Maine. And then you see here the red line is the ice margin at 13.7 to 13.5 calendar BP. And you can see right about there, it's just about to head across the international boundary into Canada. The important part about this boundary right here is that's about when the earliest dates for Clovis show up. This part of the world, up in here, could not have been known to anyone prior to that point, unless he was assuming that people didn't live under the glacier, which I think is a pretty safe assumption. So, nobody knew what was going on in that part of the world. And there are a number of lithic sources that exist up there. So you've got the Jefferson rhyolites, the New Hampshire and Mount Jasper rhyolites up here. You've got the Ledge Ridge Church source, which Adrian will talk about more. And then you have Kineo Traveler up here, which Ian talked about previously, and then also Munsungen, all of which were buried under the ice. We'll talk more about the various lithic sources and their sizes in a minute. These lithic sources are discrete, and they have discrete source areas. And they come in different sizes, as I was just saying. And this is important. You have lithic sources that range from really, really small, the Mount Jasper source overlooking Berlin, New Hampshire, which is, what would you say, Dick, maxes out at about 2 meters wide? So you've got a 2 meter wide rhyolitic dike that extends a couple hundred feet up a rather nondescript mountain face above Berlin, New Hampshire, at the headwaters of a river. Basically, it's not very big. In fact, it's teeny tiny. Then, alternative to that, you have the Kineo traveler sources, which their bedrock sources are indeed quite large, but as was shown earlier, they also got smeared across the landscape by glacial action. They are everywhere. So, moving on from that, you can take this and build some expectations based on these models that I've talked about previously. You would assume, I argue, that in a transient explorer's model where they're moving very, very rapidly across the landscape based strictly on probability, that the largest lithic sources in the region would be encountered first. There are some caveats to that, which I don't want to really belabor here. But just based specifically on probability, you would expect the largest sources to come first. People would find them randomly more quickly. There are more rocks to find as opposed to the small sources, which are going to be harder to find in terms of random encounter, which I know is not how people move, and I will talk about that. It's possible also that you could see the colonization event happen in the lithics. If they didn't know where to get rocks, they would return to known areas and bring the stone in from there. So there are a number of ways you might see a fast colonization model, especially with the big lithics. Wouldn't really matter where lithic sources, wouldn't matter where these are located. In terms of Anderson's model and the importance of river valleys to the first inhabitants of an unknown landscape, you might expect that lithic raw material sources that are located within river basins would be the first that you would see in Paleo-Indian sites. So you can go to the archaeological data and start looking. What do you see? I also wanted to throw this in here in terms of testing my own assumptions about models. So this is, or colonization models. Do you really see the biggest lithic sources if you have a population move randomly across the landscape? And it is undoubtedly yes. If you have, this is just a screenshot of a random walk that I simulated just simply in Microsoft Excel. And I had people randomly walk across the landscape. I populated that landscape with actualistic lithic raw material sources, right? So I made the sources roughly of the right size and in the right place as the lithic sources in northern New England, and had people walk around that landscape, pick up rocks, encounter lithic sources, and they did it completely random. This is a null model. This is not supposed to simulate how people actually behave. Let me be very clear on that. People don't behave randomly. We do know this, and I am not implying that they do. But I wanted to see what would happen in terms of a null scenario. What would we expect? Possibly akin to a transient explorer's model. And basically what I found is that this looks absolutely nothing like the archaeological record, which is to be expected, but that's an interesting result. We can go back to that model and our expectations of the previous models in terms of source size and expectations. What sources are we going to get? And when are we going to get them? So we have a number of sources to the south, down at Mount Independence, or perhaps more to the west. We have Hudson Valley sources that I don't have here. In fact, we've got other sources that are in the Boston Basin, Ospey Hornfels, so on and so forth. And then we've got our big sources. So in terms of Cheshire Quartzite, which can be found in various locations up and down the Green Mountain front, possibly as far south as Connecticut. Highly variable in quality, but regardless, it's there, it's big. And also, the simulation shows that if you have a long linear source, people are much more likely to run into it randomly, even more so than just a big blob of material. And then, again, like I mentioned, you have the Kineo Traveler, which has been basically bulldozed down from its source area up around Moosehead Lake in northern Maine and pushed all the way down to the coast. That makes it a pretty big source. So we would expect transient explorers to find these sources. We might also expect that the people focused on river valleys would use a lot of the Cheshire Quartzite. It's located along the Champlain Sea, which is also mentioned by Anderson that that would be a good corridor for entering an unknown landscape. The question is, what do we see? And to look at that, I went to these sites. Sites included and sites that I would like to include. And this is actually not complete. I've looked at about 22 sites now. And when you look at the lithic data from these sites, what do you find? Well, in the earliest sites, these are sites from the early fluted point tradition as based on stylistic chronologies, which again is problematic, but it's the best we've got, and try to work with what we have. So I looked at the earliest sites, and source size has absolutely no impact on whether raw materials are included in the Paleo-Indian toolkit. None at all. In fact, some of the biggest sources are ignored almost completely. Further, proximity to a major watercourse doesn't really seem to have a lot of impact on whether these raw materials entered the toolkit or not, and when. Certainly, Hudson Valley materials are common in some early fluted point sites, but also materials that are not located along major drainages or immediately adjacent to major drainages. The Mount Jasper rhyolites come to mind. They're located at the headwaters of a stream. They are adjacent to the Connecticut River, but not immediately adjacent to it. Munsungan is another example of that. Right? So you don't seem to have really strong patterns of people focusing on lithic raw materials associated with water. You don't seem to have people focusing on lithic raw materials that are large. In fact, you have people focusing on lithic raw materials that are really quite small and also not located near rivers. Also, you don't really see movement of raw materials in from areas located adjacent to the study area. You don't have materials exclusively derived from Pennsylvania or exclusively derived from New York. You have a melange of materials, and Chris Ellis has talked about this in an article as well, to pander just a little bit. So basically, none of my expectations were fulfilled. I didn't find anything indicative of any colonization model, and this is the Redmond-Sungen example, which I like a lot. Redmond-Sungen is present in every single fluted point site I looked at, every single one, in highly variable ratios, but it's there. So what you have in, and I say Diedick is a possible exception because Brian told me there wasn't any there, but we don't know. But Diedick might be an exception. Just to throw that out there, make sure everyone's clear that I am aware of that. But Redmond-Sungen is in every single Paleo-Indian site that I looked at personally for this study. So what you have is a medium-sized lithic source located at the far end of the study area, in the far northeastern portion of the study area, in an area that was one of the most recently deglaciated areas in the region, or most recently deglaciated lithic sources that I examined, and yet it is in every single fluted point site that I looked at. So what does this mean? I believe that this means, in a very real sense, our archaeological data are not sufficiently fine-grained to really examine how this colonization process took place. What I think we're seeing is certainly Paleo-Indians in the far northeast do represent the colonizing group. We do know that, but we're not actually seeing them go through that process in the archaeological record. Right? By the time these groups become visible on the landscape via the sites that they left behind, we're looking at a population that is embedded upon the landscape. They know their landscape. They're behaving in ways that are patterned, right? And they are simply living, they're not learning. They're engaged in the seasonal round. They're engaged in activities that bring them to various lithic sources, various locations where they can acquire food and other resources. And this seems to indicate that these colonization events occur either so rapidly or at such low population densities as to point out that they can't be seen. 5 minutes? Perfect. And this has been proposed as a possibility by Hazelwood and Steele and a number of others, that we might not expect to see this happen, right? And this probably relates to our ability to and it's sort of a bad thing to do, is to conflate archaeological and human timescales. Right? That human timescales are very, very small when looked at through the vagaries of radiocarbon dating. So what this really means is that when you start talking about Paleo-Indian behavior and colonizing behavior, I argue that you really should shy away from arguments that implicate ignorance of the landscape as a driver for behavior. People did thus and such things because they didn't know. I don't think those are tenable arguments. And this has been made previously for caches, that some people have argued that large Clovis caches in the western United States were hedging against moving into an unknown environment. I don't think that's a reasonable argument, and that people should shy away from said arguments. But I think it also indicates that we really need to take and become more creative in looking at how this colonization process may have transpired and how we can examine this colonization process through the archaeological data that we have. Unfortunately, I'm fresh out of ideas on that. I'm working on it, and I think certainly some conversations that I've had previously here, and hopefully subsequently we can start working it out. But in terms of this study, I want to take a more quantitative approach to the data, really start examining the site use and settlement patterns between the early and middle fluted point periods at a more quantitative approach with the data I have. I have over 150,000 data points to play with, so I can take some quantitative approaches. And also, I can finally say that I can fully move forward with some geochemical sourcing. I have just received funding and intend to go and look at the raw materials that we've looked at previously, just visually, and subject them to some tests and see if we actually know what we're talking about. And I really believe that we do. It's just nice to check. And then really take all of this data and amalgamate and just start looking at differences between early and middle fluted point landscape use patterns to really see if we can see some major differences between the two. As of right now, surprisingly enough, the biggest difference is that the lithic use patterns for early fluted point sites indicate that their lithic catchment area, if you will, where they get their rocks from, is just absolutely gigantic and larger than middle fluted point sites. Beyond that, the data haven't spoken too much more to that, but there does seem to be some indication that there is range constriction between the earliest fluted point sites and middle fluted point sites. And that concludes my talk. Thank you.